Hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation With by Kangaroo Minds. I am Vedika and today we have with us James Hatchman. James is the founder of Voice of Health, a preventive mental health app which focuses on providing individuals with a safe space to feel heard, empowered, and connect with active listeners. His experience of supporting loved ones with mental health is what inspired him to take on this journey. Our conversation today will center around active listening, especially within the context of mental health. However, before we begin today, I would like to put out a trigger warning for our audience. For anyone listening to this today, if you find any of the topics triggering or distressing through the course of the conversation, we would urge you to take a step back and take care of yourself. If you need additional resources, you can find them on our website as well. Now, without taking much time, let's hear more from James. Can you tell us, within a mental health context, what is the role that active listening plays? Because we hear so much about it that you should be a better listener, you should listen actively. So what is the role and what can it look like?
Yeah, it's such a multifaceted space when it comes to active listening, because I think certainly the way that our organization uses active listening is as a role as an active listener, but active listening is certainly spread out throughout all parts of mental health. So you would say that most mental health professionals would be aiming to try and achieve some level of active listening where they are being present with the person they're speaking to, trying to understand exactly what they're going through, empathize with them, build that trust, ask them the right questions, and go from there. And that is where active listening, I guess, settles in across the whole mental health space. But certainly, I mean, if for our organization, we use it in a kind of peer support model, which is, looking towards empowering everyone with the ability to be able to actively listen, so that no matter who they're talking to, no matter what situation they're in, whether it is mental health or not, they can utilize the skill of active listening to really provide that space for the person that they're talking to. But also there's a lot of parts of active listening that I often liken to mindfulness as well, which is how quickly can we bring our focus back to the person in front of us, because it's only natural that, our mind, bounces around to tie in with the name of the podcast, but our mind bounces around. But, active listening and the active part of that is how quickly can we bring our mind back to that person? How quickly can we start empathizing with them and really avoid getting distracted and provide that really, really open relationship where a person feels okay to self-disclose and be vulnerable. So it transcends just mental health, but it is certainly very, very applicable across all parts of mental health.
See, another thing I want to ask you, you've said a lot about the themes around active listening, which we will come to later in the conversation as well, is, where do you feel spaces like, Voice of Health and listening services like the Samaritans and other services fit into the entire mental health ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And it's something that we've had to think about, especially with our organization. I think for the listening space and the role of a listener or listening services like those Samaritans. Now, there are some services that are, traditionally more in the crisis space. But I think the active listening role and the peer support role that is similar to what we do is very much sitting right in the kind of early intervention preventative space. So right at the beginning of someone's mental health journey, because I think a lot of the services that are out there are obviously, it's an enormous leap from no support to full-on psychology support or, crisis. So where I think listening is most powerful, or listening services like ours, that do, connect people based on lived experience, I think they're most powerful right at the beginning of the journey, and potentially reducing that step to go from, okay, I'm not seeking any support, but hey, maybe I can just feel comfortable opening up to someone who has a similar experience to me, and then get comfortable with the concept of support, build some self-management tools. And if the person is struggling with something in particular, or they do need additional support that transcends the listening space, then we can move them on to counselors, psychologists. And if in some cases that may need to be crisis, but at least I think they're most powerful in those early stages.
Right. See, another thing which you started off with was, talking about being non-judgmental, being empathetic, especially around the conversation when you begin speaking to someone in the context of listening and when they're sort of starting to share their distress with you as a listener. How did you think we can develop that as a skill? Like, being empathetic and being non-judgmental, or is it something, you're just born with it?
Yeah, I mean, I do often say there are some people that even just as a result of their life experiences have developed a better ability to become empathetic, or they're just kind of a naturally empathetic person. But it is certainly something you can develop and get better at. I think a huge part of it can sometimes even just come in the language that we use when we're talking to someone. We famously always talk about the difference between what, how, and why questions, and how, a lot of us are asking why questions because they are great for reflection. But maybe when we ask them of other people, they come across with some sort of inner critic or judgment. And so can we shift that to a what or a how question? And so even just the language we use can make a big difference. And then I often think that, and it's something we actually recently added to the training that we deliver, which is shifting away from advice giving and shifting towards crafting thoughtful questions as a result of trying to better understand the person. So ask those questions, find out more about them, really listen to them, be present, hear more than just the words, hear the feelings behind the words. And as a result, you can continue that conversation and continue to craft amazing questions for that person, because a question remains relative to the person you're asking it of, whereas advice doesn't necessarily. And so we're so quick to give advice these days, but sometimes if we want to develop our ability to be able to empathize and be non-judgmental, ask a question is often my best answer for that one.
Right. See, another thing is, as you said, giving advice comes very naturally. We just start off by, being like, oh, I've been through this, or you could consider doing this. So you also mentioned that for a lot of people, it would rather help that you ask them and you sort of help them find a solution and, what works for them. So how do you think we can make that transition, from advice giving to actually listening and asking more thoughtful questions, more relevant questions to the person?
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a tricky transition for some people, especially if it's something we've done all, for a long time. And if we are, because often giving advice is not, you're not trying to do the wrong thing. You're often like, I really want to help this person and I want to give them everything I've got and I want to share it. But an example would be, okay, let's say we use breathing exercises as an example. So you might be going through something and I go, hey, you should do some breathing exercises because it'll help you. Now that's advice. But what if I change that same approach and went, hey, have you ever explored the opportunity or the idea of doing some breathing exercises as a way to manage your anxiety or to manage a situation where maybe you experience a panic attack? And they go, oh, no, I haven't ever tried those before. And you go, well, actually, I've had some success with it in the past. So now what you've done is you've asked a question, you haven't given them any advice, and then you've also self-disclosed that it worked for you. So you've normalized the concept of actually doing that activity as part of that. So I think that can be one way to kind of transition it, is to really implement questions, implement some of the self-disclosure as part of it. But it's not always easy. It's not always easy.
I think another thing which comes with, self-disclosure and talking about, oh, what, this worked for me, is using your judgment, which I think is very different from being judgmental. And sometimes we tend to conflict the two terms. So do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between being able to use your judgment through a conversation as opposed to being judgmental of what's going on or of that person?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Fantastic question. Yeah. I think anyone who says that they can be completely judgment free, it's like, well, then maybe you don't understand what the word by judgment is, because we all walk around every day with our pre-existing judgments, and that comes from our own life experience, our own thoughts, things that we've created in our own mind. But then judgmental is often some, sort of discrimination or potentially some sort of, it's often a negative thing, and it's putting down someone or, looking at what they're doing as wrong. And that's that difference between the two, because our judgments form a foundation for a lot of the interactions that we have. We go, okay, this is my judgment of what type of situation this is. Like, this is a podcast situation. So this is my judgment, and I make sure that I act accordingly and I say things accordingly, and I don't act like a wild child, on the podcast, and I'm respectful and all that thing. So the judgment forms the foundation of my behaviors. It might also form the foundation of my knowledge of who you are. So if you told me something about yourself previously, I can go, well, this is everything I understand about Vedika previously. And then as a result of what she said before, I can judge the situation we're in now to be this. Whereas the judgmental language is where, I'm starting to, like I said, having, say things negatively or see what you're saying is wrong or be discriminatory. All those sorts of things, can, and it can spark that inner critic in you, and you'll notice it very quickly, the change in language, and you'll notice the response people have, because if you're finding that everyone you're interacting with is often very defensive when you try to help them, then that might mean that your language is actually judgmental language, regardless of having your own judgments of the situation as well. Great question. I love that. Yeah, I love that question.
I think, that's a very good way of looking at it, that, sometimes your judgment is more around the situation as opposed to being judgmental when it comes to, like negatively perceiving the individual themselves. Definitely. Another thing is, you've come from a space of lived experience. And how do you think that lived experience contributes, to the active listening process? Like, can it enhance the conversations that we have? And can we draw upon our experiences within those conversations as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so it's funny because myself and my business partner, Luke, we often talk about the fact that each of us, we both kind of represent both sides in a little bit, but most of the time we represent both sides of the same coin, in that he comes from a lived experience where he has gone through his own mental health challenges himself. But my main lived experience, I would say, with mental health is that really active support of loved ones who've really struggled through some pretty serious mental health struggles in their times. And I think with the active listening part for me, as far as my lived experience, really, really ties in to those moments. And as a result of probably going through that lived experience, I have learned what works, what doesn't work, and the ability to just be able to provide a safe place for someone to open up has been so powerful for a lot of the people that I love the most, to be able to open up and to be able to share, and even, encouraging them to self-disclose. But I mean, I know them, so I know what they're going through, so it can be interesting. But it's, sometimes the people that are closest to us are the ones that we actually find ourselves being least present with, because we do have the most amount of pre-existing judgments. So, tying back into the question before it, I think if you can provide that safe space for even the people you care about the most, and use active listening in that sense, it can be a very, very powerful tool for the lived experience of caring for others. When it comes to the lived experience for yourself, I mean, Luke always attributes his ability to be able to manage his anxiety now to the fact that he was able to open up to people around him about his lived experience, and they were there to listen and empathize with him. So it does both. It can go both ways.
I think, you mentioned something very relevant, which is that, sometimes with the people we care about the most, we also take that assumption that I already know so much about you. And somewhere that comes into the conversation as well. You make a backstory in your mind when that may not be really connected. But another aspect of lived experience, which I wanted to ask you, which really came up recently in a social media conversation that I was having, is the semantics which we use. And as people with lived experience, do you think people should be excused from the semantics that they use? Because, like, I'll give you an instance.
I was going to say, give me an example, and I can.
Yeah, like for instance, there was a conversation around a person who is a parent to a child and said that, I'm worried that I will infect my child with my anxiety. Like when their child behaves in a certain manner, I'm concerned that, they would be infected. Or someone with depression has said that, let's say that I didn't end my life because I was more rational than that. Now, just because you come from a space of lived experience, should that excuse you from, being able to say,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't use the word infected, because it makes it sound like it's something that's not meant to be there as well. Because, like, I mean, and I often say this is the difference between experiencing anxiety and when people use the term suffering from anxiety as well. I think I think the language you use to describe it is really important, and it's something that we always try and concentrate on, because there's also the concept of using language that labels the person as the identity or the identification for them is their mental health. So that language is also really important, I think, to avoid, because it stops that person from moving forward because they attach themselves to that as their identity. That's the second example, was that I'm a more rational person. That's also another very, it's certainly language I wouldn't use. You can take a rational approach to your thinking around it, definitely. But to say, oh, I didn't do it because I'm rational, is like saying every person who ever did wasn't a rational person. And it actually, I guess it removes some of the, you're discrediting all of those people previously who maybe have gone through that and have struggled, and it didn't matter how rational they were, it still was so overwhelming, and they didn't necessarily have the tools at the time to be able to manage it. So I think regardless of whether you're suffering, and I understand that like people in an emotional state can certainly say things like that, and that's okay. But I think if it's in a proper discussion around the topic, I think people do still need to be quite mindful. And I get that some people like to use powerful language, like infecting my child and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it can certainly give off the wrong message to others, because especially if we're going to be sharing our lived experience, we want to be sharing that in a positive way and sharing it in a way that empowers others rather than making them feel like a virus. Because then you go, oh, I don't want to infect my child with anxiety. But then you're going, okay, so that means any person that has anxiety or is suffering from anxiety is a form of virus. I'm like, that's where the language is getting a little out of hand and probably need to rein it in. So yeah, I agree with what you were saying.
I think, that's where, like, even as whether you have a lived experience or just an active listener, without the lived experience, it's where language plays such a huge role, right? We don't often realize that the power that our words carry. I mean, and it goes beyond terminology for suicide. And as you said, like, the way you refer to people with their, conditions, you don't use them as adjectives, for instance. You have to be really mindful in the way you talk to someone, or even in this case, interact with that person. It's not just always talking. It's even like the kind of content you're putting out online, the words you're using in, text, or in this case, like messaging services like, VOH. Now, coming to another thing, we've spoken for a little bit about active listeners, but who do you think can be an active listener? Like, does it have to be a mental health professional to do this? Or can anybody be an active listener?
Absolutely anybody can be. The best conversations I've ever had about mental health have not been with mental health professionals. It's been with everyday people who have experienced it, who have gone through it, whether they experienced it, whether they've experienced the people around them go through it, whether they've seen it through just their work or anything like that, their colleagues, whatever it is. Those are the people that I have found have had the best insight into this. Don't get me wrong, mental health professionals have an amazing ability to do this because they've obviously learned so much. They've got a lot of knowledge, but I think that absolutely anyone can be an active listener or display active listening. And that's partly the reason that we exist, is because we were like, well, what's the most scalable approach? It's like, well, why don't we find something that everyone can do, and then we empower everyone to be able to do that? And rather than, having this shortage of mental health professionals, it's like, what if we empower every individual who has a lived experience? Because we all do have our own unique lived experience. What if we empower every single person to be able to utilize that, then add the skill of active listening, and then provide support to others who might need that as well? So yeah, I think anyone can be. Yeah. My best active listeners are just people you would never expect to be active listeners to, which is awesome.
I think, probably as you mentioned, that maybe initially people do come to the conversation because some form of lived experience they've had. I think, given the rate of prevalence of mental health conditions today, I don't think any of us can say that we've not been touched by it, either directly, indirectly, or, we have a friend or a colleague or a loved one, somebody who we care about, who is going through distress. We've supported them informally, but just being able to get them, be trained in that space to be able to help. So in terms of active listening, like, what do you think some of the barriers that exist which people face, in terms of being a better listener?
Well, in terms of being a better listener, so not in terms of access to mental health, but in terms of barriers, in terms of being a listener. Yeah, I think one of the big barriers is actually something we talked about before, which is actually learning to put your own judgment aside, or to move past your judgment, which is to go, yes, it can form the foundation of knowledge, but actively listening is really moving past that and trying to dive deeper into who that person is and what they're going through. I think that's one of the biggest things. People often really struggle because, especially if they're very set in their own ways and they have a particular way of thinking, it can be really hard to push that agenda aside and to just go with whatever that person is saying and become almost, that's what is it? It's the difference between sympathy and empathy sometimes as well, I think, is another big one, which is, sympathy feeling for someone and then empathy feeling as someone. I think that ties into also being able to put aside your judgment, is probably one of the biggest barriers. Other barriers for active listening. It's some of the conversations you have when you're actively listening to someone who's going through mental health, it's a pretty intense, it can be a pretty intense conversation, and it is perfectly described by the word active, because it is something you have to actively do. Otherwise it'd be called passive listening or just listening. So it can take its toll. Compassion fatigue is a real thing. We always encourage every active listener that we have on our platform and that we speak to, we encourage them to make sure that they are always trying to look after themselves as well. Like, don't do it too much, because you need to take time for yourself, reflect on it, absorb it as well. So that's not necessarily a barrier to starting, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind when it comes to being an active listener in an ongoing setting. What other barriers? I'm just trying to think of some other barriers for being a good listener. I think the advice thing, again, is a big one. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I was expecting maybe a question about the barriers to mental health, but now you got me thinking about the barriers of being a good active listener. I think it's just that maybe it's just like any other skill. It takes time is another one. It's not something you like. I'm lucky enough to have had a lived experience that has prepared me to be a good active listener, and I teach this stuff and I teach all this content. And even now I'm still slowly trying to get better and better. And sometimes, I slip up and I'm not as good as I could be. So I think that the fact that it can take time is a big one. And a lot of our default settings as humans don't aid us to being good active listeners. One of my favorite stats that came out just recently that I read, which was that we give ourselves 30% less time than we would give someone else to respond. So we're often so geared to listen with the intent of replying rather than listening with the intent of absorbing, understanding, and replying. And so I think that's often a big one as well, is that we don't give ourselves the time we should to really absorb it and reply. And so that then means that we act on impulse rather than actively listening and absorbing it and empathizing as well. That's a great question. I'm going to go away from this thinking about that. The next time someone asks me that, I'm going to have a better answer. But yeah.
I think you shared a few things. You mentioned compassion fatigue, and that's something which, even we were going to come to, that sometimes as a listener, the conversations can be very heavy. They can actually take a toll on you as well. So how do you think listeners can practice self-care and set healthy boundaries?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think, well, if you're setting health, there's two parts to setting healthy boundaries. One is kind of boundaries within yourself, going, okay, I'm only going to allocate this amount of time, and I need to put in place kind of almost, I guess we'll call them boundaries again, but boundaries as to when I need to, or almost triggers in a way, like things like cues. That's the word I'm looking for. Cues as to know when you've gone, okay, I'm starting, I've put too much into this, and maybe I can see it starting to affect my life, or are these thoughts, interrupting my day outside of the time I'm providing support. So that's one. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So the second part of the question was, sorry, just repeat that second part of the question again.
Like, how do you practice self-care as an active listener?
Oh, practice self-care. Sorry, that's right. Yeah. I think, yeah, the practicing the self-care is taking time for yourself. It's stepping away from it and understanding that is okay. I think, because a lot of people, they go, oh, I just want to keep providing support. And I've had active listeners who have said that. They're like, I get really addicted to helping people because I can start to see the difference I'm making in someone's life. And that can be a really fantastic feeling. But I'm like, but is it then negatively affecting your ability to look after yourself? It's great for them, but how are you looking after yourself? So stepping away, writing down your thoughts, reflecting on it, I'm a huge meditation person because I think that's really important. It doesn't have to be long. But even just giving yourself a moment to consolidate your thoughts is a big one, and consolidate your memories of the situation and processing it is a big part. And you can actually also even set boundaries with the person you're talking to. You can actually tell them like, hey, this is everything I'm comfortable talking about, but when it starts to dive into this other space, this is where I just feel a little less comfortable, and maybe that might be better off spoken with someone else or a professional in that sense. So understanding where your role starts and ends as an active listener is actually it's actually both a form of self-care, but also a form of boundary setting as well.
See, the point you also drew upon, which we were going to come to, is around triggers, right? Like sometimes as an active listener, you really don't know what the person is going to come and or what they're going to talk about. So how do you deal with a conversation or a topic which might be personally triggering for you, or it might be a view which is completely opposite to something which you personally believe in?
Yeah, such a fantastic question. I think, yeah, it comes from, I think, especially for us. I mean, it's hard in a day-to-day basis, because it's really hard to know when something is going to be triggering for us. I think knowing what your triggers are and actually doing some self-reflection around what they are will help with our particular program, and with the app that we have. Part of that training is just understanding, that there is a boundary, and then when things do get out of hand, that you should step back, and that there's absolutely no obligation to continue to support someone in a situation where you're getting triggered, because you have to look after yourself first. And it's a mentality that we do want to put in place, because the last thing I want is one of my active listeners to feel, any sort of angst or unhappiness as a result of a conversation they're having, which it might have, and it might trigger some feelings, but that's where I guess self-management tools come into play. And we're actually trying to introduce some new features into the app, and also some additional resources that we send out to all of our active listeners around self-care as well. Because there are things like vicarious trauma as well. So you can actually have a situation where you begin to empathize so much with someone that when they go through something tough, you feel that same pain. And so there's so many different parts to this that are I'm trying to think of an answer that doesn't go on for 2 hours as well with that, because there are so many different aspects. But I think, setting the boundaries is a big part of that for a lot of people. I think that'll help.
So another thing is, if you had to give some top do's and don'ts around having a conversation about mental health with someone or supporting someone, what would that be?
Oh, the do's and don'ts around mental health. Yeah, this is a good one. I get it. I think do understand the context you're in and the space you're in for that conversation. I think because so often, and it ties into what we were just talking about, is like you definitely need to know the extent of your abilities and the extent of this type of support you can provide, and recognize when it has exceeded beyond what you're capable of providing. That's would be my number one, because I think so often people go, yeah, this person, I love them, they're a family and I will do anything for them. And that's fantastic. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily equipped to take on everything, or that you have to do it alone. So knowing where your limits are is a big part of that. I would say you can give advice, but don't give too much of it. I would say shift away from it as much as you can. There might be moments where you go, I know the best path forward for them, because you're trying to work together with them, but shift their perspective to see the path forward themselves rather than pushing them down that path, I think is another big one. I would say try and avoid seeing a person as their challenge. So don't see the person as, anxiety or PTSD or this particular lived experience or this bad situation they're going through. See them as a human, first and foremost, and then see them as someone you can work with, and you can help and support. And that can be hard, because we often go, that person's so anxious all the time. You're like, well, no. Okay, that person is going through some anxiety, but that's not who they are as a person necessarily. But it is something they're going through. So I would say kind of separate the two is one thing. And I don't think we do that enough in mental health in general. I could go on a rant about that as well, but we won't today. I think just you can never have enough empathy in a situation. Like you can just continue to try and empathize with them. It's even in those moments where someone says something that you completely disagree with, like you were saying before, you can still empathize with them, because if you were truly empathizing with the person when they say something that conflicts with what you're thinking, what you think, then by empathizing with them, you can put yourself in theirs and go, okay, based on the experiences they have had, the thoughts that they have, the judgments that they have, I can see how they have that view. You might not necessarily agree with it if you apply your own judgments to the situation. But if you go, oh, let's try and get into their mind and feel their feelings and see their perspectives, then you could go, okay, actually, I can see how they got to this. It might not be necessarily what we consider right, but we can still help them from that space, of a space where we don't necessarily agree with them. So I would say throw in empathy, use active listening, obviously. That's what we're talking about. Whole lot of love. I don't know. Is that, are you allowed to say that? I would say throw in a bit of that. I think they would be the big ones for me. And then really remember that building trust with someone is going to be the foundation for any positive relationship you have with them. If you can't effectively build trust with the person you're talking to when you're providing support, then your chance of actually being able to help them in the first place is going to be very minimal. So I would use that as kind of a core foundation for helping someone.
I think also, just to add to what you said, it's like, giving them that genuine positive regard where, you don't see them as a label. You don't try and even label them. So if the person doesn't come out and say that, oh, I have a diagnosis of anxiety, just because they're appearing anxious or worried, we shouldn't jump and be like, oh, you know what, you have an anxiety related issue, or do you think you're having a panic attack right now? I think it's not our role per se to go out and, start diagnosing people or start using those terms, clinical terms, to really start describing them. And I think because labels come with so much weight, especially in the mental health space, I think we have to be even more mindful during the conversation that what are, the terminology we'll be using. And again, it all comes back to the whole semantic conversation where you're just very careful about the words that we use as well. So another aspect of, the way you carry out that conversation is like our own responses to people, especially when, the other individual is being vulnerable and sharing their stories. How can we be more authentic in the way we respond to them, so that they feel comfortable to share, so that they feel heard, just so that they feel empowered, which are things, which right at the outset we spoke that was the aim of building, your app, that people should feel seen, heard, and empowered during those conversations. So how can we, in general, as listeners, give them that space?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, there's obviously the kind of practical side of things where we talk about things like minimal encourages, even just giving someone non-verbal cues in a face-to-face situation, or in like this situation where we can nod and understand and stuff like that. It's showing that we really are present for them. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think to make someone feel empowered and listened to, I think it's, we did, especially if we talk to a lot of people who study in psychology and stuff like that, and they talk a lot about rephrasing and phrasing and things like that, where, you take what the person says, rephrase it, and then, tell it back to them. But I always say that if you're properly empathizing with someone, then you're really, it's an interesting question, I guess. How can you do that the best? Because we do talk about doing that and making someone feel that, but what are the best ways to do that? I think, yeah, I can't stress this enough. I mean, I'm always the biggest fan of some sort of self-disclosure or showing that you can be vulnerable. I think a lot of people want a connection. They don't necessarily want, a blank canvas that they can just throw things at. Some people do. But I think a lot of the time they really want a connection. And even if it means them doing most of the talking, it's still a connection. And I think just trying to have the intention of discovering everything there is to know about that person as your primary intent, as well as if you come to that conversation with, how can I help this person? If that's your first and primary thing, or how can I support this person? Maybe not help. Maybe not use the word help. Maybe how can I support this person? I think you'll find that your actions will naturally end up being ones that do help that person feel listened to and understood. And I often I use the basic example of like, you may have, if you ever want to try this, meet someone new and use the line, act interested, not interesting, and continue to ask questions about that person. And you'll probably find that person will walk away going, geez, Vedika is such a great person. She's so lovely to talk to. And you might have said nothing about yourself, but you've showed an interest in that person. And you've really tried to understand them, and you've asked them questions. And as a result, they feel like they can trust you because you showed an interest. So I think that it all leads from that initial intent of wanting to support the person and really to discover who they are. And then that naturally leads into the trust, it leads into the empathy, it leads into the questions, and then it leads into, potentially helping them shift their perspectives on certain situations. So it gets kind of a flow on from there.
Yeah, another thing that can happen in all practicality during a conversation is you may be absolutely tongue-tied. And I think we shouldn't ignore that possibility does arise. It's sometimes when someone says something or discloses something, we just may not know how to respond to them in that moment. So what do you think you can do in that situation? Like, is there something, like a few things you can just say to because you need more time to really process what they've said?
Definitely. And my advice would be, don't pretend. Tell them, be like, wow, you've that's an interesting point you raised. I hadn't thought about it like that. Or I might need a moment to think about how to respond to that actually, because that's an important thing that you've raised. So acknowledge that they've brought up something that's made you think and that has helped you, that you need a moment to process, rather than just saying something because you need to fill the time and the space in between, and you're like, oh, I'm stalling while I think of what I'm going to say. I think if you can just be like, wow, great question, hadn't thought about that, give me a moment, and then just move on and go from it. I think that's completely okay. I think so often we try and pretend. It's that old, people used to say that about job interviews questions as well, when they say rather than pretending you know something that you don't, just tell the person, I don't know, but I'll find out. It kind of ties into that same thinking, which is going hey, I don't know the answer to that question actually, but I might need a moment to have a think about it. Would you be okay if I just took a second to think? Person will usually say, yeah, of course. I've never heard anyone say no. Answer me right now. So that would be my advice.
See, another thing, again, which you mentioned was about filling the space. And sometimes we get so uncomfortable when it's silent, right? That we just have to say something. Even as a listener, it makes you very impatient. Let's be real. If the other person isn't saying anything, we just feel this urge to jump in and fill in that gap, which is not always a very helpful thing to do. So how do you think we can, harness that power of silence and not have that urge to jump in? Because that will come with practice. It doesn't come very naturally to us that if it's just dead silent or the person isn't responding, not saying anything, not typing anything, to jump in.
So you can do it. You can keep silence. We could practice it if you want. And it can be uncomfortable. That's why I was just being silly. That's why I added a little bit of a pause there for you. But you're right. We go, oh my God, silence. What's going on? How can we do this? It's a hard one. I think that maybe the transition is being able to introduce minimal encourages, as I said before, which is to use small acknowledgements of what they've said, but not necessarily a response. That could be something that might make people a little bit more comfortable to go, okay. And then you go. So you're kind of okay with the silence. But I mean, I always use the quote, and it's one that I found. I don't know who actually said it originally, which is you found a best friend is someone you can sit in comfortable silence with.
Right.
When you have someone who you could sit there, you could both be doing nothing, just looking off into the sky, but it's not uncomfortable because they're there. I would say that if you can harness that feeling and when you're providing support to someone else, I think that's a big part of it. But yeah, it's funny. We are often anxious with silence, and it's a hard one to teach. I think it comes with a little bit of confidence as well, because a lot of us think that if there's silence, there's something wrong, whereas there might not be. So I think shifting that perspective is a big one, that's silence is a bad thing. It's interesting. I would love to know, if I could put my finger on what was the actual like history of this fear that we have about silence, I would love it, because I'm guilty of it as well, filling the space with words. But yeah, I think, you know, it's something like try and transition through minimal encourages, and then understand that it's okay to be in silence, and that it is not necessarily a negative thing. But if you do need that extra time and you're worried about filling the space, ask the person for the silence. So prep them, be like, do you mind giving me a moment to think about that? And then the silence is justified as opposed to awkward.
And I think even like the other way around, right? Like maybe sometimes you can tell the person that, okay, I understand that, you know, we've spoken a lot and maybe you need a moment or two to think about it. So you're just telling them that even you're okay with the silence, because sometimes both sides can become very uncomfortable when it's silent, and you may wonder, have I lost the person? Or, you know, are they still listening to me? Have I lost them? Have I said something wrong? So really don't know, as you said, where it comes from, but somewhere I think we're just not okay with like those pauses sometimes.
Yeah.
Sort of learning to be okay with that is something.
And I think I like that point, which is about it's okay to give someone permission to be silent as well. Like you said, like, hey, if you need a moment to think about this, take a moment. I'll give you a sec. We do that. You would have seen that in some of our workshops that we do. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'll give you 15 to think about this. Go have a think, sit in silence. That's okay. And that permission can be good, can be really good.
I think sometimes people need that. You know, now I'm going to come to another very important aspect about these conversations, which we don't talk about enough, is literally the winding down aspect. You know, we think that it's the whole listening, but at some point you need to wind up the conversation. But if you don't do that well, you may literally undo all that effort that you've taken into the conversation. Everything that both parties have put in can literally be wiped out if you've not, you know, wound up the conversation nicely. So how do you think we could do that better?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It's something that I think is definitely underappreciated as something to be able to do in your conversations. There's a few different kind of avenues that I think I take and that I often talk about when it comes to winding up conversations. Depending on what type of conversation it is, one of them can be like setting goals, and regardless of whether they're small or big, or setting some sort of agenda for the time between when you're talking now and when you next talk can be a big one. So like, I do this in everyday meetings. I'm like, okay, cool. So let's set the date that we're going to meet again, and then let's talk about what we're going to achieve until then. It's like, you know, so you could say to someone, hey, how about we check in again in about 2 or 3 days? And in that time, maybe, you know, how about you try and see how you go with some breathing exercises, or in those moments, maybe, you know, concentrate on this one question in those moments when you're experiencing those things. So that's like mental goals, and it's like some things to think about as well. Acknowledging that you're really grateful for the person that they've shared everything, and that you feel fantastic that they felt comfortable enough to open up with that. And I think kind of future looking, like, hey, I'm really looking forward to the next time we get a chance to chat and talk about this, and I'd love to keep this conversation going the next time. So it's that future perspective that I think can really help with wrapping up a conversation. But it can be hard, and sometimes it can feel so awkward when you have this really deep, meaningful conversation. And you're like, well, I've got to go, and and that can be the end of it. You're like, oh, that's brutal. So I would say some sort of future, you know, and look, I know this doesn't sound probably like the right thing to do, but sometimes even if you have, you know, future-based language, even if there's potentially not a realistic chance that you may actually end up speaking to that person again, at least with putting that intention out there, I think that can be a good way to finish it up. Have you got any good tips for winding up a conversation?
I think my whole thing that I was going to come to is, you know, just knowing that at what point are you not moving forward anymore? Like, you know, if you find that you're going round and round in circles, at some point you need to tell the person that, okay, you know, maybe like, I think we've explored this enough, and maybe, you know, we can come back to it later. Or like, let's say it's a helpline, then, you know, if you're like a responder on a helpline, you can probably say that, you know our number, and you can dial in, and, you know, you'll have someone to talk to again, or like in your app that, okay, you know, you can come back and chat. Or if it's someone you know, like in person, or if you're talking to them on the phone, you can be like, okay, we've, let's say unloaded a lot today, and maybe we can, I'm going to be here to listen. So you're giving them that reassurance that you're not going to run away from this conversation, but maybe we should, reflect on this and come back to it at a later time or a later date, probably. Because if you just stretch that conversation, sometimes I feel like endlessly, you will lose that person at some point. Or they may feel that you're not listening, that it may become repetitive, and they may feel that I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. Like, did you not listen to me enough?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially if you're coming back to the same point over and over again. I definitely agree.
I think like that's a good cue to know that this is a good time to stop. Like we need to put a stop to this conversation now and like just come back to it later as well. Like it's not that you have to hang them and be like, okay, bye, like don't ghost the person, but that would be awful. But maybe just tell them that, hey, I think we've explored enough today and we can come back later to this. Just give them that space for reflection, give yourself space for reflection. And even in terms of vicarious trauma, like you have to know that you're not going to pick up more than you can handle as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, yeah, that's the thing is if you've had a big, long conversation with someone about a whole bunch of topics, it's actually healthy to maybe take some time to really absorb all of that, because you might have such a large conversation, you cover so much that they forget what was discussed at the beginning and they're only concentrating on what was discussed at the end. So taking that time is, I think it's important to say like, hey, how about we take some time to consolidate what we talked about and we'll come back and revisit it. That's actually a piece of advice I give for people in arguments a lot as well. You're arguing, it gets really heated and you're like, okay, how about we just take a moment, we go out, we go back to normal life, we switch this argument off for a sec, we consolidate, we gather our thoughts and then revisit it. And it's something that's actually something actually my dad, funny enough, and my stepmom influenced in our family when I was growing up, which was that like you can walk away from an argument at any point if it's getting too much for you, only if you can promise that we'll come back and revisit it later. So we don't throw things in the bin, we don't just discard them or ignore them. We make a commitment to the other person that we're going to come back and revisit that. And so that's been that we used to do that in arguments, but it translates outside of arguments as well. It can be really powerful for active listening or for quite heavy topics that you're discussing with someone.
Right, because again, like, just giving them space, because even for the person, it can be quite draining because you don't know if they've ever spoken to someone about this before, if they've had that chance to like, offload what they're going through. And also partly the vulnerability hangover, like you don't want them to feel that at the end of the conversation that, oh my God, have I overshared? Because you're also drawing that down.
I love that term, vulnerability hangover. That's awesome.
That's
a great term. I haven't used that term before, but vulnerability hangover. That's awesome.
I think it's just for people that, you don't feel that you have that regret after sharing that, have I said too much? Like, did I overburden the other person? Am I putting myself in a situation where, I'm just feeling very like exposed, or I've said way too much to be comfortable with. So if you start winding up, maybe you let them feel that, you're in a safe space. You shared enough. You don't have to feel that you regret what you've spoken about, but we can come back to this. Like, give yourself that time to process what you've done, what you've said, and what we've discussed as well, because sometimes you can lose the essence of the conversation in that whole time. And now
and acknowledge it. I think it's important for someone to go away and acknowledge what they've learned as well, like as part of that process. Sorry, just to add on to what you said.
Yeah,
but that's
absolutely.
Amazing. Yeah, I love it.
And now coming back to present times, beyond active listening and everything, we're going through a pandemic where everyone's supporting each other. We're going through things we've never been through before. But at the same time, there's a lot of conversation around this new normal that we're going to probably get into. So what is something you would like to see in the new normal?
Oh, that is a great question. Something I would like to see in the new normal. I think, so many I can think of. I'm just trying to pick which particular setting would be best. I mean, I definitely think, I'm going to use the whole like working from home as a foundation for this answer. But I think I would like to see as part of this new normal is just the acknowledgement that every single person has different needs for the way that they work, for the way that they think, the way that things, what's the way that they're the most productive. Some people will be going in, some people are more productive in the office, some people are more productive at home, some people are more productive with a hybrid model. Some people, mentally their job is very draining when they have to go in, or when they can have even just one day at home, that can be all the difference to their productivity. And it's acknowledgement that maybe they have their own things that, that make them different, that help them, reset mentally. And so I think that would be one part of it. I think would be really, really positive for people, is just the acknowledgement from employers that everyone works differently, and that you don't have to, no one has to be in an office 9 to 5 to be able to get the best results. Sometimes some offices do, but some don't. So that's a little bit outside of mental health, but I think that would be my big one, because it does tie into the acknowledgement of us being all very different in the way that we work and the way that we operate in the world. I often said, I think some people have spoken about this, but I said this very early on when people were talking about, oh my God, COVID's the worst. And I was like, yeah, it's really, really horrible. And it's sad that it's happening. But if we were to apply some sort of positive thinking to it, well, we've all now got one thing that we've got a similar lived experience in. We've now before it was being human, now we've all been through COVID as well. And so it kind of, it gives us all, and I mean, it happens. I talk to people all around the world, and I go, one of the first things is, how's everything going over there with COVID? You know what I mean? It's almost given us something to talk about that we can all relate to. Like, yeah, man, it's a struggle, isn't it? It's like, yeah, and I'm struggling as well. It's been hard. Oh, we've been hit really bad. Yeah, so have we. We've had some lockdowns. So I think that realizing that we've all been through something together, and that we can empathize with each other from that angle, I think is one part of the new normal, which I would like to see as well. And to continue that mentality, I think would be important. And maybe just the distribution of resources for certain areas within mental health, I would say. I think, it's shown a lot of the loneliness epidemic that they talk about how people, we're so connected with social media, but we're actually feeling the most lonely, or suffering from the most loneliness, I guess, because you can be alone but not be lonely. Yeah. I think that's another thing that people don't realize. So I think that the acknowledgement of that as an issue, and hopefully people start to send resources to organizations or causes that that issue, or trying to at least take a human approach to that. That was a shameless plug for Voice of Health as well, because that's what we're doing.
So lastly, if, to wrap up, what would be one piece of advice that you would give anyone who's having a hard time with their mental health right now?
One piece of advice. That is a very good question. Find someone, or don't underestimate the power of reaching out to someone and actually talking about it. I think it sounds, people go, yeah, I know it's good for me to do, and I should talk to someone about it. But I think, don't underestimate how powerful that can be. And you may not even necessarily see the effects immediately, but even just having that one little outlet to kind of open up about that is a big part of it. And because that also creates that connection, because you may connect on similar lived experience in that sense. So that would be my thing, is don't underestimate the power of reaching out to someone to talk to them, I guess, would be my thing. Yeah.
So on that note, thank you for joining us today and for, being part of this session. I think it's been very educative, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to benefit from listening to this and from all your advice, from all your experiences. And lastly, for anyone who's watching this today, just know that, if you're having a hard time with your mental health, just know that there's always help available. There is someone out there who will listen, someone out there who cares, and that it will get better. So give yourself that opportunity, because you deserve to heal, and it is possible to get better as things move on. So till next time, please stay well and stay healthy. Thank you.